Hello, it's Patricia Warby, Alchemy Therapies, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about emotions and trauma and how we surprisingly are beginning to reevaluate how we make meaning of the things that happen to us and therefore what we can do to resolve it. So, if you're interested in the understanding of emotional healing and recovery from past experience, then this is the place for you. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking today is not just my own experience of working with hundreds of clients, but also the experience of Lisa Feldman-Barrett, who is a researcher. She works on the nature of emotion and the brain. She's a neuroscientist, and she's done some incredible work, which I talked about in my first video. If you haven't caught that, that's a very quick summary of some of the information that she's putting across. And I recommend you watch that first. I'll put a link above. But this one, I'm going to go into a little more depth because there's things I want to really dig down into, because there's loads of nuance here that needs pulling out from the point of view of a therapist who works with people. And that's probably the distinction between me and Lisa, in that, hers is a theoretical perspective. Although she does give plenty of examples from her own life, I'm working with people and I see these patterns over and over again. So let's begin. Let's look at really the start, which is that we create emotions on the fly, okay? But there is no signature to an emotion. She gives the example of anger, a furrowed brow, for instance. We tend to think, oh, there must be a pattern, a neurological wiring pattern, and therefore a facial recognition pattern that determines the nature of that emotion, that says this person is angry because they have a furrowed brow. But she gives an example that could be they've got indigestion or they're concentrating really hard. And what she found in her research was that emotions are as individual as we are. And certainly in my work, I've seen anger patterns to be expressed in many, many different ways. Some people's eyes go hard, their faces go flat. Other people get a tightening in the jaw. That's a very common one. Some people's legs start to jiggle. That they feel like they want to do something, or their arms start to move spontaneously. Really bizarre, but this actually happens when you're using EMDR because it takes you into a trance-ish state. You're not asleep, you're awake, but it takes you out of your intellectual reasoning and into your imaginative, creative brain, which is a really big part of who we are. And so she found in her research that there was no such thing as an emotion signature, and that it was coming from a predictive state of the brain, where the brain was predicting what it believes is happening, a meaning that it's made of the events of whatever that person is experiencing, and that the meaning is largely based on what's happened before. It's there to actually save energy, because to create a new emotion or a new response on the fly every time you experience something would be totally exhausting. And actually being aware of what was going on in your body and monitoring everything, well, that happens, but to be consciously aware of that would also be totally overwhelming. We'd never pay attention to anything outside of our bodies ever again, would we? Because everything would be impinging. And that, I believe, is the basis of anxiety. It's an over focus on what's wrong inside the body and these interoceptive signals. So that's a really important understanding. Now, what is an emotion then? And how does it differ from a thought? Well, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure we've really answered that. But what I would say is that thoughts tend to be there all the time. They repeat. They are very insistent. They feel like they're trying to analyze a problem, and they come up with solutions, and they tend to be therefore, quite repetitive. Emotions, on the other hand, tend to be almost instant. They flood our bodies, and then usually they pass if we allow them to. If we hold on to them and try and analyze them, that's where you get the anxiety. So emotion is more body-based in my view. I agree with Lisa on that. I've always felt emotions were physiological. They're coming from internal sensations that we are interpreting. We're interpreting what's happening to us. And therefore, emotional memory, which is a very distinct form of memory that doesn't relate to a narrative, it doesn't relate to a beginning, middle, and end kind of narrative. It's not language based so much, it's more to do with a sensory feeling based on something we felt before and this prediction that comes in from that experience. So it really doesn't exist in the brain as such. And I think, again, Lisa was saying that it's therefore not something you can map, and that's a really rather redundant or bankrupt perspective. She said, looking for the neural correlates of a particular emotion, don't think we'll ever find that. I have seen so many different versions of the same emotion that I'm pretty certain they don't exist. Thoughts and perceptions, however, they do seem to be patterned, and they do come in ways that we can almost predict. So if you find it difficult to tolerate certain experiences because it reminds you of past experiences that were overwhelming for you, for instance, we call that a trigger. And it does tend to create thought patterns that relate to being our child past, our little child within, the inner child that is screaming for help, validation, to be heard, to be witnessed. And the thoughts that generates is, well, it's largely shame-based, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's also culturally based. And this is an important perspective that I hadn't really considered as deeply as Lisa has. And so she gives the example of a person who grows up in a culture in which violence or derogatory actions towards women is really common. And this young woman doesn't feel that that's particularly unusual. She's experienced it, but she doesn't label it as traumatic. And then she watches something on Oprah Winfrey, and decides, because she sees all these other women saying, this happened to me and it's really traumatized me, that what might have happened, therefore, in this culture is a trauma. And so it produces a series of thoughts and perceptions, and sometimes also actions, which follow on from thoughts and perceptions that are of a traumatized nature. And so we're not saying that you create this, it's largely unconscious, but it happens from your brain's interpretation within the cultural context in which you are situated. Now, if we often get congratulated if our thoughts are dominant, our intellectual capacity is dominant, you're considered rational, you're healthy, you're a fine, upstanding citizen. But if your instincts and emotions win, many people are found to be irresponsible or childish or even mentally ill from that experience, because our culture labels that as a problem. But emotions are so much a part of who we are. They should be a guidance system for our life. It's not about them dominating, it's about the balance. And in many ways, it's the balance between the imaginative, right hemispherical being and the analytical, thought-based left hemispherical being. We all have a balance between these two things, and we're meant to have these two things together, okay? So that our feelings and our thoughts can be balanced and interpreted in ways that benefit us. So you're not ill if you're emotional, but you're out of balance. And I think that's the best way of thinking of it. If you're constantly feeling anxious or depressed, the balance in your perception system has become out of whack. So I think that's just such a an organic way of looking at it rather than it's a imbalance of neurotransmitters in your brain and it needs a chemical to fix it. It's about your interpretation of the world in which you inhabit. And therefore, as I mentioned last week, the primary mission, Lisa's mission, was to show us that we are the architect of our lives, that we have more agency than we think we have. And that's certainly what I do with people. I help people engage their emotional side because many of us repress and deny. And then I bring in, hopefully, a more imaginative and associative interpretation that allows for compassion and understanding of why you experienced what you did and the meaning you made of it. So, and that is what enables people to transform their experience of life away from blame and shame, and therefore they stop getting locked into these very physical states of lock-in, fatigue, chronic pain, weird neurological symptoms. There's so many ways in which the body will express what the what the person cannot, because the person has got locked into an intellectual vacuum, if you like, of understanding themselves as primarily flawed. So Lisa also talked about the importance of prediction, very much so. And she said that you feel sensations before the signals actually arrive. And she gave the example of a cup of coffee, drinking a cup of coffee. And this really resonated with me because I've noticed this with myself. So if every morning you drink coffee at a certain time, your brain is predicting that you will have a chemical that constricts your blood vessels at a certain time each morning. If you then don't have that cup of coffee, for whatever reason, I've done a coffee detox. I've done a couple actually in my life where I just stopped drinking coffee. One of the first things you're going to get is a headache because your brain has predicted that you're going to have coffee, and so it's actually expanded your blood vessels, which is what gives you headaches and migraines. And so this is the familiar, coffee detox headache. And it has a real physiological basis, but it's based on the brain's prediction about something that was going to happen even before it's happened. So you act first and then you sense. You don't sense and then react. That's really important. She also gives an example of exercise. And I thought this was so amazing. So if you exercise the same way each time, all right, the brain predicts how that's going to run and it gets more efficient. And so you've probably heard the example of, tennis pros practicing their serve and getting really, 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 really good at it because physiologically your brain is able to predict exactly how much energy you're going to need exactly at what point. So, you basically, you get really efficient. Now, what if you then switch to doing something completely different, like interval training, where every 30 seconds you do something else, it gets called out, you're running or you're rowing or whatever you're doing. I've done interval training. I don't enjoy it, but some people really, really do. Now, here is the thing. You can't predict what's coming next because it's down to whatever the machine is telling you or the instructor is telling you. And so it will be wrong. And so your body has to then adjust on the fly and you end up burning more calories as a result. And so that's interval training, and that's why it's so powerful for actually, weight loss and fitness. So you're learning how to take in what she calls a prediction error. So the brain was predicting that you'll continue doing something, and then you change and do something else. And the prediction errors are signals that enable you to change the patterns, not just in something simple like exercise, but also in the way you relate to your world. And that, of course, brings in the whole notion of trauma. So trauma is something that overwhelms your nervous system's capacity to cope. That's my definition of trauma. And so it can be anything that happens to you. We tend to have more and more trauma, I think, in our lives now because we're under such stress and pressure, but also that cultural awareness of trauma tends to create more perception of trauma. And therefore, it kind of builds and builds. But remember, trauma is not the thing that happens to you in the world. It's an experience that is a combination of the remembered past and the sensory present, as I said last time. And so your brain is using the prediction, it's using its cultural inheritance to understand and make meaning of what's happened to you, um, and then it creates a certain thought pattern, a belief system, and an action as a consequence. And it can create terrible symptoms because it becomes about you and how you felt about it rather than about the other people or the individuals that were creating the trauma for you. And so that's where shame comes in. Because if it becomes about me as a person and not about whoever is perpetrating the trauma or involved in the trauma, then it's going to be embedded as a feeling of I'm wrong, something about me caused this. Unfortunately, that's how we tend to interpret bad things that happen, particularly as children, because of magical thinking. We tend to think it's our fault in some way. And so shame then, which is I am bad, I am wrong, I don't fit, I'm inadequate in some way, is what becomes the story that we tell ourselves. And this is the thing that goes round and round in our system and creates these horrible symptoms, because shame is one of the things that really slows down our physiology. It inhibits our repair and rest mechanisms. It tells us basically that we're a bad person and we don't deserve to be here. And people can get very, very stuck in those shame feelings. I do believe it's also the basis of things like Tourette's, which is a severe sort of tic that people have, whether vocalizations or just movements, a deeply held anxiety, but also an interpretation that something they're doing is part of the problem. And I think that's what embeds it and creates this terrific fight and flight motion, which is what the tic is. You know, it's a need to get out of the situation, but there's no adequate action. And so the energy of the response gets stuck in that person. And that's why it becomes repetitive. I mean, that's also the work of Peter Levine. If you look up Ray's story online, Ray, R-A-Y, you'll see he worked with a veteran who had a very unfortunate sort of Tourette's tic, and he managed to help him recover from that through using these kind of somatic tools. So it can be dealt with, but it's largely to do with the brain's prediction and getting stuck in a loop. And so coming to an end then, understanding how these things work, the importance of the culture, the context in which things are embedded, and the idea that we're not hardwired in the ways that we used to think. We used to think that our brains were hardwired in very particular ways. And actually, they're culturally inherited. What we call epigenetics now tells us that it's many different ways in which it's inherited. It's both a physiological signaling system in our DNA, and it's also a behavioral system where we're observing other people and mirroring their behaviors. And it should help us survive. But of course, if people in our environment have been traumatized, then we're going to actually pick up some of that, particularly if we're emotionally close to them. So I do think actually it does give you the option and the ability, the agency to change the ways in which your brain responds to particular signals by introducing prediction errors. So things that contradict what your brain interprets. So let's take the example of the shame story. You know, I'm a bad person. This is happening to me because I made it happen. Bringing in a new scenario, which is I did nothing to create that. That was what happened to me because of, you know, whatever was going on with the person that created that situation. I was just a child. I had no power in that situation to change what happened to me. By introducing a contradictory narrative, which is the basis of positive thinking, I guess. But the way I do it is I install it unconsciously by using EMDR, which is a eye movement desensitization process, it goes into the back part of your brain, this more unconscious, imaginative, connected part of your brain. And so it kind of gets installed as new software, which is really, really powerful. So if you can understand what happened to you with a new meaning and a new interpretation, you're increasing the amount of prediction error in the system. And that is what creates the pattern interrupt. Now, I'm going to look next time more at reframing the meaning of the past and how your identity is changed by that, because many people, when they learn these beliefs about themselves, it becomes part of their identity. And so I often find people are traumatized not because they suffered abuse or abandonment, but because their sense of identity becomes challenged at some point in their life. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that next time. So, folks, if any of what I'm saying here sounds interesting to you and you'd like to explore doing this personally on a one-to-one basis or even in a group, I offer both modalities. Find me on alchemytherapy.co.uk and come have a discovery call with me where I'll be able to talk to you and find out where you're at and what might help you. Everything, I believe, can be healed. Take care. Please subscribe, and it really helps my channel. And thanks so much for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.